I come to sense that Imphal, which I left around about 35 years ago for my study outside the state, has become a full-fledged Indian city marked by traffic jams and dirty roads. I was stopped incidentally by 10 minutes almost by a truck with full of loads, and it wasn't working, and they were trying to push. I could also help them. So, and secondly, I would also like to thank the Medical Society of RIMS. It's a privilege to share some of my thoughts. This is the first time that I'm speaking in this institute, though I'm familiar with other institutions in Manipur. As for medical institution also, this will be one of those rare occasions where I get a chance to speak to doctors. Last time I got this chance to share my thought was an international conference in Fortis Hospital in Delhi. On a similar themes, I spoke. Without further delay, I just want to start my lecture. As you know, the title is called Well-Being and Structural Violence Towards a Social Psychology of Health. There are 4 segments in this lecture. The first one is, I shall call it Setting the Agenda. I'm trying to provoke you a little bit and try to come around and try to see what can be understood in your profession as well as citizens of this place. The second segment is Conceptual Framework, where I try to explain some of the concept that I'm using here and title. And then I shall go to what I shall call the premise. And lastly, I'll talk about the implications for medical professions and the very concept of health. To start with, I shall quote a very oft-quoted remarks, and I'm sure that many of you are familiar with this statement. The first one is something that I've learned during my clinical psychology course and during my PG in Delhi University, which I also used to teach for 5 years later on, called community psychology. One of the basic premise of community psychology is stated as follows. Community psychology is not the application of clinical psychology in community setting. The importance is not. It's not that clinical psychology go to a community setting and you practice your craft. That's not the idea when we talk about community psychology. Very idea of the disease, very concept of health, the very concept of clinical practices changes completely when you think about community psychology. So the first statement is, community psychology is not the application of clinical psychology in community setting. That's the first premise, and I shall try to use this as a trope to problematize our understanding of medical profession. And the second statement is something that a radical shift in the way we understand the idea of disease and health. And some of you are familiar with this, especially those professionals who are aware of women's movement and feminist scholarship. The statement goes something like this. Hysteria, which was popularized by Sigmund Freud in psychoanalysis and psychiatry in general, he says that hysteria is nothing but the medicalization of basic discontent of women under patriarchy. Women have a problem under the patriarchal institutions, and you medicalize, and you think the problem is with the individuals, the women. And so the feminists have this particular reformulation of the same problem as hysteria is nothing but the medicalization of the basic discontent of women under patriarchy. And these are the 2 tropes that I still try to use to reflect on the medical professions and the very idea of health and disease, and see whether what we can make sense of it in our specific context, particularly in states like Manipur as a part of this Union of India with increasing inequality in our society. So that is the 2 trope that I shall be using it. And next segment that I shall try to clarify some of the concept that I am deploying here, which is already there in the title. And the concept of well-being, I am sure that you are familiar with because your well-known WHO's definition of health has this phrase called well-being. It's not the mere absence of disease and infirmities, but of social, psychological, and physical well-being of the individuals. That's the definition that you are familiar with. So we have a concept of well-being in that. So what is well-being? My simple definition is that well-being is a socially rooted sense of a good life. Let me repeat it again. This is to suggest that well-being is a socially rooted sense of good life. And here I put the idea of good life under quotation. And by using the word sense, I'm trying to avoid a particular trap that we often try to reject, called subjective. The moment you say subjective, you think that it has nothing to do with an objective reality and so on. And therefore, I am deliberately skipping that word and using the word sense. What is a good life? For this, a brief note to another familiar dictum that all of us are acquainted during our school days. Very oft-quoted definition of human being by Aristotle, which says man is a political animal. And I can tell you that my experience in the last 20-25 years, even the trained political scientists have a misunderstanding of this expression by Aristotle. Even in our school textbook, it is wrongly written as we are gregarious, we are a social being. That's not what Aristotle meant when he says man is a political animal. What does he meant when he says zoon politikon in Greek? What he meant to say is this: we have as human beings two forms of life. One he called it zoe, and one he called it bios. Joy, in a simple word, could be called natural life. That we have a body, we have a physiological entity, we exist. So you can, in simplified versions, we eat, breathe, drink, sleep, and have sex. These all five elements are to do with the survival of the human species, both as an individual as well as a collective. If you don't breathe, you die. If you don't eat, you die. If you don't drink, you die. If you don't sleep, many studies are done, you will die. And if you don't have sex, the species die. So these five elements determines our character as an animal. That's why we are part of the animal kingdom, as what Aristotle suggests. And that is what he refers to as zoe, part of our existence. And then Aristotle goes on to suggest that we have an additional life, which he refers to as bios, or the political life. What is that? He suggested that we lead a qualified life, not merely a natural life. What is that qualified life? We qualify as a good life, beautiful life, just life. It is these qualities of a qualified nature of existence marks human being differently from the animal kingdom. And this particular aspect is what he refers to as political life, a qualified life. And in his theorizations, we exist in search of a good life. And all our endeavor in that sense on politics for him is nothing but a part of search for a good life. So what is a good life? Is a monarchy? No. It is a democracy. And what is a democracy without equality? So justice must be there would mean what kind of justice? So we go on. So we constantly search. That's why Aristotle's philosophy is referred to as teleological and normative in that sense, what ought to be. When we say death of politics, it would also mean that when we stop thinking about this search, we reduce ourselves to being merely mechanical, animal kind of an existence. And that is the idea of a good life. So if we go back with these conceptions that we have this additional life, which actually defines who we are as human being, as a political animal. And by the way, he also talks about two concepts related to this called oikos and polis. Oikos is traditionally what referred to as family today. So our natural life and its needs are taken care of by oikos, which is the family, and our political life, which is the good life, search for a good life, is taken care of by the polis, which is the state now. That's the function of the state. So if we understood this part, then we can conclude that essentially we live in a normative world. we exist in a moral order. And I shall give you one example from a French social psychologist, Moscovici. Once suggested that what psychologists famously study something called helping behavior. Does it exist as a physical act or a physical condition? His argument is no, it doesn't exist as a physical condition, and he said it's actually a moral entity. It is a moral realm. It doesn't exist in a non-moral realm. And he tries to clarify this concept by giving an example of breastfeeding. You think about two women who have delivered each child, and one woman is having trouble in feeding her baby, so the neighbor's wife takes care of that one. So he says that when you see this woman, when she picks up her own child and feeds the baby, you see the baby suckling the nipple and so forth, and she is holding the baby. Similar kind of act is seen when she does the same thing to the other child, which is not her child. He says, both the activities, you don't quite call the first one as a helping behavior. The second one is what you term it as a helping behavior. So the reality of helping behavior is not the physical act of breastfeeding, but it is founded upon our concept of what is duty, what is responsibility, and so on. And that is at the realm of the moral, not in the physical existence of our life. Therefore, he says, many of our human activity in that sense, in the similar sense of Aristotle's definition of our life as a political life, is a normative existence. It is a qualified existence. The day human beings are not longer defined by this normative order, then what happens is that either we reduce ourselves to an animal-like existence. Lot of thinkers have talked about mechanistic existence of human beings. Some of you are familiar with famous films like Modern Times by Charlie Chaplin. And if you read Karl Marx, for example, you say, that's how modernity has done to us. We act like a machine. We no longer equate ourselves uniquely as a moral existence. And that is very crucial for us to understand our existence. So in that sense, the very idea that you have in your definition of health called well-being is a socially rooted sense that you derive of a good life. If you don't have a sense of a good life, then you are not healthy. As simple as that. So that is the foundation. And why do I say socially rooted? I shall come back to it when I define the aspects of health and social psychology. Before that, one of the critical concepts that I'm invoking here is this concept of structural violence. It was flagged off by a philosopher and a well-known sociologist, Scandinavian sociologist Johan Galtung, in one of his essays in 1969 called Violence, Peace and Peace Research. And since then, it has been widely deployed by various professionals. And I'm sure some of you who work in the area of public health and community medicine must have been familiar with this concept because there are articles relating structural violence with medical professions and so on. So let's try to decipher this a little more so that we can understand. Other concepts are relatively easier for us to deal with it. It invokes the concept of violence. It is the violence that we understand is to be deciphered a little differently from what we normally think about. The meaning of violence that you and I tend to have is of a physical nature. And Johan Galtung says that violence is somatic incapacitations or deprivation of health alone, and killing being an extreme example, at the hands of an actor who intends this to be the consequence, the harm that he causes to us. In simple word, we think about violence as somebody inflicting physical force on another individual and harming it. That's the definition of violence. And Johan Galtung, in 1969, when he was writing that essay, which became very popular and a lot of people commented, and it continues to be a critical concept to understand society and individuals' life within it. He says that this definition is very, very limiting for us to understand what violence would mean. In fact, if you look at the root of the word violence, it means something being violated. It's a violation of something. And what is that something? If you have already understood from the earlier definition of we as a existence located within the moral realm, as a political animal and so on, then we will immediately sense what is being violated is the body, one, but not only body, our own political animal life, my right, what I think I ought to be. I ought to be treated in this fashion. So a woman being treated differently because she is a woman is a violation. So it is a violence. So it's not merely in the physical sense of violence, it's a larger context of violence. And what is interesting in Galtung's concept is this, that he extends this definition to understand some of our troubles that we face in our contemporary life. And I shall read it out, the segment, and he gave example from medical sciences as well, and I shall read out a little portion from that. His definition is that violence is that which increases the distance between the potential and the actual, and that which impedes the decrease of this distance. That's his technical definition of violence. What he meant to suggest is that as he gives an example, and in his example he says that if a person died of tuberculosis in the 18th century, it would be hard to conceive this as violence, since it might have been quite unavoidable. But if he dies from TB today, despite the medical resources in the world, then we would say violence is present according to our definition. What he meant to suggest is that something that is avoidable, and then you are depriving that person, and then the person is being subjected to violence, in simple words. I mean, TB in the 18th century, you don't have the resources to deal with it. So if somebody dies, you will not call it violence, because the potential distance between the potential and the actual is the one he measured it. Today, the potential of saving the person is so high, and actually if he dies from that, then we will call it is caused by violence. And it is this concept of violence, he uses it to deal with many issues, which is what I am invoking here to understand the concept of disease and health. In his concept, structural violence is, broadly speaking, refers to the social structures, economic, political, medical, and legal systems can have disproportionately negative impact on a particular group of community. In what it is, the systematic deprivations of people, denial of resources of various kinds, whether it is medical services, whether it is economic, or is it the political rights, all kinds of, this is a systematic form. And in his idea, this may not be a very obvious, it can exist in latent form. For example, let's think about women's life and how they are subjected to what she calls it, or what Galtung will call it, structural violence. So for instance, when you have a rape victim, for instance, you only see the act of rape and brutalization of a body as violence. But there's a larger structural violence against the women which we don't quite yet see. For instance, you say, why did you go out in the night? Why did you wear it like that? Is your life nothing now that you have lost your virginity, for instance? Is it a question of honor, for instance? All these things are being what the women suffer. That's why she will not speak out. And the law is also tilted, and many of us must be aware that we still have a Victorian law, where in US and in the Western countries, even the word rape has been avoided. It has been now substituted largely with the word assault. It is a part of assault, and it is nothing to do with izzat or honor, but it is a matter of dignity. It's a worldview has been changing all across the world, but in India, it's a Victorian definition. Until and unless there is a penile penetration by the penis, you don't consider it as a rape. And in fact, Supreme Court recently struck down this two-finger test as a patriarchal worldview which subject women to humiliation and so on. Now, the other aspects of rape is that it is not a crime of passion. It is nothing to do with the honor or the izzat. In Manipuri newspaper, you will find izzat mangal lame, it's a dishonoring. In US and Western or the feminist scholarship, they see it as a question of dignity rather than honor. So let me briefly explain these two terms. What is honor and what is dignity? Honor is a status-bound concept. That what is status? Our location in society. So you exist as a mother, as a woman, as a tribal, as a father, as a brother, as a sister, as girlfriend, boyfriend, wife, husband. These are our location in society. Based on our location, we have certain code of conducts, what can be done and what must be done to the person. You don't speak to teacher like that. You don't speak to women like that. So these are code of conduct rooted in those status, that is the location in the society. Now, when you infringe upon those code of conduct, then you call it as a question of honor. Unlike this concept of honor, the concept of dignity is based on a right, the notion of right. In other words, it's a right-based concept. So what it says is that each individual, women or men, are born with inalienable right. And the question then is that it's my life, it's my body, what I do with my body or to the body and with whom or whatever style I want to do is my right, is my choice, is my consent. So it is a right. Women has a right. You know that in modern history, women don't have right. In fact, Western modernity used to think that women, the native, that the colonized people, and the neurotics, and the children are incapable of rational thinking and they don't have, therefore, rights. They were not given the rights to vote, right to participate in public affairs, to join profession and so on. So women do not have right. Now the contemporary understanding is that whether it is women or men, each individual is born with inalienable right. You know that it was marked sometimes around 18th century and it was codified. One of the classic moments is French Revolution, where the first article of the Declaration says, all men are born free and equal in rights. And this phrase was paraphrased by the feminist movement, first in US with the suffragists, when they started saying that men and women are born and equal in rights. And therefore, rape is a matter of dignity. That is, it's my life. It's my dignity is defined as my right to do whatever I want, what my life is all about, what I do with my body and to my body. It is the rapist is infringing on that individual right. So it is seen as a dignity question. And therefore they also started changing the phrase like rape into sexual assault. Sometimes even they will stop the word sexual, they will simply say assault. Why? Because the rape may not necessarily involve penile penetrations. It can involve even insertion of irons and woods and stuff like that. In India, it's very difficult to define it as a rape. You know, the infamous case in Delhi, Nirvaya case, law had a tough time because we still have that European IPC guiding us. So in the West, anything that infringes on your body against your will, is that the question of dignity? Now, if you look in this sense, structural violence is deeply rooted because the manner in which we understand female sexuality, women's selfhood, is all rooted and they are placed in certain marginal positions. And when this thing happens, that is why we have old concept. You know, why did you go out in that dress? Why do you talk to men like that? Why did you drink with them? And so on. And all these things are part of what Galtung will call it structural violence, which is implicit, latent, but pushes somebody in a disadvantageous position and thereby disturbing their sense of good life. In other words, their own health of these individuals. So how the structural violence is related to our own understanding of what health is. This is where Johann Galtung concept of structural violence is very helpful. And there are other lots of paper in terms of who get access to medical facilities and so on, using the same kind of thing. Or for that matter, our own location within the structures. How do you treat a patient which comes in a car and a little well-dressed, you can see from the texture of the skin? Do you behave in a similar way when you see that patient, or a patient which comes from a particular socio-economic marginal position? Do we have the same attitude? Do we act in a similar way to that one? These are cultural which imbibe in our behavior, whether it is doctors or otherwise. Now, Sudhir Kakar, a very well-known psychoanalyst, gives this beautiful example, which I often quote in my lectures. He says, think about, if you think psychoanalysis is universal law and doesn't matter whether you come from different cultures, he says, think about a Christian white analyst, psychoanalyst, a psychiatrist, doing a psychoanalytical session with a Chinese patient. And he starts in the usual fashion in his psychoanalytical session, and this Chinese chap started saying, Doc, last night I had a lovely dog meat, the dog was very healthy, it was with my friend, and we decided to eat him. And the blue flame and how the skin came off, and the color of the dog changes and so on. He was describing, and then how delicious it is. And Kakar argues that this Christian white analyst is bound to have a kinesthetic reaction in his skin. Thereby saying that he is not a neutral listener as a psychoanalyst. His whole cultural bearing of being a dog lover, white means for fun of, and we are notorious, though I don't eat meat, red meat. I know our Northeastern student, one was chucked out from our university. I know that he is one of the big guy in one of the hill district as ADC chairman or something. I heard about him. He was thrown out of our university for killing a dog and eating in his hostel room. And we know it is a delicacy. So for him, the Chinese patient is sharing his dream or his experiences. For the Western client is bound to have a very different. And he said, similarly, he said, think about a Brahmin, vegetarian Hindu Brahmin psychoanalyst listening to a Muslim patient. And this guy started with the beef story. He's bound to react. Kinesthetically reaction. In other words, what is this kinesthetic reactions? I can give you one example right here now. You just try to mention your genital in your own language. You will have a kinesthetic reaction. Inhibition, it is felt. It is a cultural value which enables us to react and respond in a particular manner. So when you think about structural violence, this larger socio-cultural structures, the manner in which it shapes our understanding of the world, the way we treat patients, the way we understand a particular disease even, is affected by this larger. But like most modern scientific discipline, you tend to think that it has nothing to do with it. In this sense, I would like to remind our esteemed audience one of the famous quotes which I love from a book called God and New Biology, written by Arthur Peacock on the modern development in biological science, and he was asking the question of life and whether God has created or not. And in that book, the first thing he started in that book is something like this. He says, a scientist knows what he does as much as a centipede knows how it works. It's a very complicated exercise to work with 100 legs. They don't stumble, they work. And so he's saying that the scientist knows what they do. I mean, if I change for a moment in this audience, a doctor knows what he does exactly like a centipede knows how it works. What does Arthur Peacock mean by that? Why did he open his book? He said, many of our assumptions, many of our ideas, we don't check it. We take these things for granted and we started dealing with it. And then in my third segment, I'll try to decipher some of this foundation, why it is so difficult to conceptualize the first two quotations that I have shared with you, that community psychology is not clinical psychology in community setting, or even to see something like a disease called hysteria as nothing but the medicalization of basic discontent of women under patriarchy. Why? We tend to find it very difficult to conceptualize. Let me go forward, therefore. I skipped the social psychology. I still come to when describing this premise. I'm going to go through both physics, linguistic, and certain philosophical debates, including medical science, can be implicated in that, and see how we understand things. Now, if you're aware of reality, let's take a very simple example. A very small band of electromagnetic wavelength is what our eye can see. is something like, if I don't remember the exact number, it's something like 450 to 700 something nanometers of the visible spectrum, what we call it Vigor. And imagine if human eye is capable of seeing only those band called infrared region and not this visible spectrum. If somehow our human, biologically speaking, our eyes could only see that infrared regions, what would be our concept of day and night and Valentine days and red roses and so on? You will not have that concept. There will be no Chaudhary Ka Chand and all that famous Rafi songs to serenade your lovers, because night and day would have a very different implications. Now, think of another example that I would give it. Think of this room, and if we put like what is that called? That machine that flies these days, I'm slipping this word, drone. A camera here moves, and think that this drone is capable of moving in the space as well. You move out, and you are the observer sitting on that drone. You will see each one of these apron-wearing people. You will have a meaning. And you say, oh, this is a medical college. These are meanings that you have. You move. Suddenly, after, say, maybe 300 kilometers, you will not even see rims. If you move again up, you will see Earth. You move away, slowly, then even the solar system will become a dot. Move further away. I mean, if you think from Proxima Centauri, which is around about 4 light years away from Earth, if the drone moves to that one, what kind of world do you think that this will exist? From where we stand and we see world, and if you change this position, your sense of reality will not longer be the same. So what I'm trying to suggest is what in scientific discourses is called vision from nowhere to vision from somewhere. Why did Arthur Peacock says that scientists know what he does exactly as a centipede knows how it works? There's a lack of reflection in consciousness. And therefore what you think is that what you see is the reality. Now that for the reality human being exists, if you happen to be someone all your life have been standing something like 1 light years away and standing on that, rims will not exist, human lives will not exist. It is not going to be part of your reality. That will change. These are two simple examples. In a slightly more philosophical debate from Newton, I would like to give an example from here, how physics has moved from what is called Newtonian paradigm to the Einsteinian paradigm. Newton derived his idea of what it is often called Cartesian dichotomy. There is an observer, which is me, and you are the observer. So what Descartes once suggested is that you should treat reality as a machine that exists out there. In his word, an automata, which works on its own. It exists out there. So the job of the scientist in the Newtonian physics is to describe and explain that machine, how it works, what are its component parts. This is what we call it mechanistic model of reality, which mythical science is a classic example of that. You look at human being as a machine with different parts and system and how it works, what are its functioning. That's how you know as a scientist. Now that is an idea given by Descartes to Newton, and Newton started doing that. And to cut a long story short, towards the end of the 19th century, in the beginning of the 20th century, physicists confronted with so many findings which sort of challenges their assumptions. Take, for example, Dirac's experiment. When you fire an electron, you get 2 holographic images. And he says that, is it possible for a particle to be in 2 different places at the same time? Only Lord Krishna can do it. And then one simple example is that if I give from a book by Zukab, and Dancing Willy Master, which is on quantum physics, is that think about 2 people standing in the window, and I'm throwing a tennis ball, and I say, when you catch the ball, say, you got it. So he threw, and both of them simultaneously say, we got it. Now the question is, can the particle be in 2 different places? Now another example, I am a man, therefore meaning I am not a woman. Now this, you know that photoelectric effect of Einstein. For long time, you used to think that light has a wave property, and in his finding, he found that electron is being kicked off when this beam of lasers was given, and that means only a particle can kick off another particle, and therefore they conclude that light has also a particle property. So it has a wave as well as a particle property. Time, Newton's uses is an absolute frame of reference. All the events are to be hung on that. Then Einstein came up with his theory of relativity, and he talks about time depends on who observes it. Now then also you have a physics law which says that time slows down as it moves faster and faster, the more. And you are familiar with his example of twin paradox. So there is a twin, one is put on a spacecraft and allows to travel the universe, another guy stays on Earth. And when they meet at a particular point in time, hypothetically for instance, the person, his own sibling on Earth is 40 years old. And if you calculate the travel time of this man on a spacecraft which moves around the speed of light, is like 20 years. So he's younger. This is from a book, I love a very popular book by Stephen Hawking called Brief History of Time. And you see that. Now what happened is that time is not an absolute frame of reference. In fact, it is part of the same phenomena that we are watching. So that these are the things that they change. So earlier notion of time, various conceptual ideas. Initially these physicists refused to change their idea in spite of all these findings. And they had this famous conference in Copenhagen, which resulted into what is known as Copenhagen Interpretation, which is used as a theoretical framework to explain quantum phenomena. Now, this is the theoretical model through it. Now, this leads to Stephen Hawking and people like Heisenberg to argue that what we know is contingent upon our question. In Heisenberg's own work, in his famous book in the 50s, Physics and Philosophy, he argues that what the physicists know or see or understand is not nature in itself. It is nature as exposed to our method of questioning. This position deeply problematizes the idea of a dichotomy between the observer and the observed. Because whatever we know is contingent upon our theories, our concepts, our theoretical model. So Stephen Hawking, who died recently, concludes that whatever he knows about the universe is contingent upon his theoretical model. And he says that still it is quite possible that the sun actually moves around the earth, but we don't know. I mean, in order to develop that model, it will be more complicated and we are not able to do it. What we are able to do is that we have a model and which seems to work. And then, what we experience is what we take it. But strictly speaking, I cannot claim that this is the universe because it is contingent upon our theoretical position. It is this position of the physicists is referred by modern philosophers as model-dependent realism. That whatever we know is given by our theoretical concept and the idea that we see. And I would like to end with one example, another idea in this, to understand that whatever we know about medical sciences is also deeply part of our theoretical schemes, our ideas and concepts. And you change those concepts, you probably change your understanding of what the reality is and how to relate with that. George Wald, Nobel Laureate for his work in vision. He once said that he's done extensive work, of course, on animals and so on vision. I think, if my memory serves me well, I think he got Nobel Prize in 1932. The year may be wrong, you can check it. Today you have Google Professor accessible to everybody, so you can check George Wald's year of Nobel Prize. I don't exactly remember now. He says this example. He says that when he put an object in front of an individual human being and in front of a frog, he says, I noticed similar chemical and electrical processes in the retina as well as in the occipital lobe of the frog as well as human brain. But then he said, but if you ask me whether the frog sees the way I see, and he italicized the word see, does the frog see the way I see? And he concludes, this, as a scientist, I cannot answer. And then you relate to these things that what he meant there is that you and I have a consciousness. And that's why, and we also have a language. And that's why we can understand. Do you see? The person will say, yes. You touch a patient, he says, is it feeling pain here? He says, yes, then you get it. So we are possibly communicating through words and language. That's why we know. So his question is, though the chemical and electrical processes in the retina and the occipital lobe of the frog as well as human being's brain is the same, he says, I can't say whether the frogs see the way I see. This brings me to the last aspect of my premise. All of you, I can give you a few seconds. Think of this room. Fill this room. Think of this room without any words. Is it possible? Try it out. Can you think about this whole without a word in your mind? It's not possible. You think about the fan, the speaker, the audience, the chair and table. We sense our world through language, through words. There's something that we normally don't practice. You suddenly realize that whatever we know is through words and language. This leads to a famous hypothesis in linguistics. Is this Spira-Whorfian hypothesis. It says that our thought is determined by our language. It depends on our language. And there are cultural variation in the way, the number of white that an Eskimo sees, the number of words they have for different kind of whites, we don't have it. Or, for example, anthropologists tells us that, the idea of a certain emotion, you have a word for it, but you don't have an equivalent of those feelings abroad. In some cultures, Richard Sweater, a professor of psychology and anthropology at Chicago University, he said that there is a concept, in Indian concept, he was talking about his field work, ethnographic work in Orissa. He said, Laja is a concept. And he says when he went to Utkal University for his field work, the professor, he said, I needed a research assistant. So one PhD scholar was given, and the Indian professors introduced this girl to him like this. He says, Professor, she is a very intelligent and hardworking girl, but she is a little shy. And Sweater couldn't understand what does it mean by she's a little shy. Because the concept of shyness is not what the Indian professor was indicating. It's a specific culturally rooted emotion called laja, a deference for senior, a deference for elder and people in power you don't quite assert. And this particular emotion, he says, doesn't have an equivalent in the West. I can give another example closer home. I try in my teaching, I often use Manipuri example in JNU or Delhi University while I was teaching. It is also kind of a politics I do, because, you look like scholars if you quote the Sanskrit slokas and, quote from Ghalib and something, which I can't do it. So I often said while I was teaching research methodology, I said, those of you from outside the state, maybe I'll translate for you, or you must have you've seen this. There's a saying which I often mention in my methodology class. Iroina urok thong lando urasu ude hayu. That means even if you see a buffalo crossing a Burma bridge, it's a rough translation. You see these bamboos like this, and you keep bamboos there, 2, 3. So you walk holding the bamboo, and if you see a buffalo crossing that, even if you have seen it, always say you haven't seen it, because no one will believe you. So I think when we talk about science and facts and data and so on, there is an element of believability. And that's a deeply human psychology. And Stephen Hawking problematizes beautifully in one of his interviews to The Guardian. He says, what happens? He says science will be boring if we found out the ultimate unified theory in physics explain everything in the universe. And he was asked, when we're likely to get that unified field theory to explain everything? He said, I hope we don't find it, because it will be very boring afterwards, because there's nothing to investigate. Everything is explainable then. Then he says, okay, does it mean that everything will be explained? Then he says this word, not really. What is the example he gave? He says, even that perfect science, within quote, predict that you will die of hanging. And if you ask this man to cross a rough sea in a small boat, he will think thousands times before he get into the boat. So that means it depends on the person how faithful or trust he has to your theory and science. And he said that element of human being will always escape from our investigation. And this medical science, When you reduce into a human as a machine-like figure, when you do away with this feeling, even your definition, three-way definition of disease, sickness, and illness, the social, the subjective, psychological, and a physical condition, if you often tend to concentrate is on the disease part of the one, the physical part of the one, and you have this Patch Adams, a very famous Hollywood picture, a real-life story of a medical professional, which inspired, incidentally, a Bollywood production called Munna Bhai MBBS. In the original one is a novel as well as a very well-known book. In some of the medical courses, I was told by my colleagues from medical colleges in Delhi, that some of them showed this to their students and to discuss about the way they look at the patients, the individual. How do you look at the patients to understand that part? Now, you can understand this word example, the human choice example, the moral order that I have talked about in discussing of trying to understand our life. Now, if you look these premises, then we will say to a very particular position which is known among social scientists as the question of location. And I would like my esteemed audience to reflect from your own professional vantage point whether this is applicable. Though I know I have seen articles on this, I'm just provoking you to think about it. What is location? He said, vision is not from nowhere. In the Newtonian physics, the objective reality is out there. I see it, you see it, everything will be the same. Now, in the Einsteinian world, he says what we observe is a process of which our act of observation as well as ourselves are implicated in it. It's a process in which my act of observation as well as me as an observer gets implicated. I am not outside of that process that I am observing. And that's a peculiar position that scientists have taken in physics, for example, to that Hawkins position of all that I know is given by theoretical model. What is the world out there, the universe out there, I don't know in itself. This is a return to all philosophical problem, which I'm not going to come, but I'm only referring to hardcore scientific facts and their understanding as it stands today in our world. Now, if this is the condition, the vision that we have is always from somewhere, because I am getting implicated in what I see. I see this whole from this position, you see from there, and you see from that position. So what we get to see is a location. Your location is important. From which vantage point you see. I'm pretty sure that even in medical science, you have competing theories about certain diseases and how to go about treating that patients. This brings me to this location. The location would mean broadly, your training, your social background, and your ideology, your political affiliation, your aesthetic tastes, and so on. Now, if you think that whatever you know about your medical science and which enables you to behave in a particular manner is deeply, deeply structured by that location, your gender, your class, your cultures, your institutions where you are trained, the kind of readings that you have been exposed to, and etc., etc. All these will determine, and a person who is aware of that location, the assumption that we have today, and very popular assumption is, that understanding will be much more fairer, insightful, and meaningful when we perform our duty as professionals, whichever field you are from. So this question of location is important. I read one article last night. I just flicked through. Some of my students also sent me some articles I wanted to share, but I couldn't go through it. It was very late by the time they sent. 7 articles they sent me from Delhi yesterday on these areas about structural violence in medical professions. One of the things is that, the way you treat your patients is a very obvious one. People have commented as a part of structural violence, that doctor inflicting violence, you're not aware, you're not consciously targeting. It's an implicit part in the way you treat your patients. And that's a part of a structural violence that people talk about it. Now, if we see this one, these premises, that what we know is determined by our locations and so on, then there are chances that you, not only as an individual, but as a professional as well as, my assumption is this, like all other social scientists are saying today, that you will become a better professional and a better humane professional in that sense. And your understanding of the world is much more sharper than what a mechanistic model of medical training will give you. And how far it is possible or not, in fact, this novel, Pastor Dam's, this Hollywood movie, has a tragic end regarding this, how far you can change a medical profession, which he tried to change by establishing a hospital, very different ways of looking at the patient and treating them differently and so on. This brings me to the last part of my premise, and I'll briefly talk about this implication already is coming up as I talk about it, is that in medical science, the little that I'm aware of it, is that not only you have theories and theoretical model on disease, what causes disease and how it should be treated, and in certain areas, there are competing theoretical models. There are competing professionals, who tells you a different kind of way of treating, old-fashioned, new-fashioned. You do it. Of course, we continue to say that it's based on experiment. Then you know that most of experiment is going to be taken on the ground of statistical analysis at the end of the day. Here comes the most crucial part of what I've started with. We are a moral being. We make choices. We have rights. So Giorgio Agamben, a well-known Italian thinker, writes that disease and death is a human decision. When you say a person is dead, that's a human decision, and you have certain parameters to define that that is not an absolute truth that exists out there. It is the doctor who decides the person is no more. And when you say the body is dead, there are still living cells in the body. Which part of the organ fails, and you will say the person. There are protocols, and these are the models. In olden times, what you call today brain dead will be burned. They will be cremated. Now, because of the medical science and your decision, you cannot do that. So death is a decision based on certain parameters, and these parameters are human creation. So individuals make decisions. We often forget this because we essentially are political animal. We have rights and we have a free will in that sense. We make decisions based on our cultural ideas and concepts and the words that I have learned in our life. So if this is the agency, what are the general implications? I'll just end with a few examples of a medical profession, which I have already started saying it about death as a decision. This is a book from a book called Bare Lives, and Homo Sacer by Giorgio Agamben. It's a well-known book, and there is actually a chapter on that, death as a political decision. And you can go through it if you read it. And I'll end why I'm suggesting to doctors to read philosophical texts and so on. And I'll, when towards the end of my lecture, I'll just mention some. But before that, I have mentioned patients' access to health facilities is part of structural violence. And what causes the disease or ill health or whatever you call them is also deeply related to this structural. I have seen in my neighborhood cancer patients who prefer to die without investing on it because that he or she would love to leave behind for their children because they know that they are poor. And some patients you will go it. Not all patients go to super specialists. Majority of your profession confronts day in, day out regular patients. So this is also another essay by Ashish Nandi on what kind of priority that you do it, and your imagination of yourself as a professional depends upon your decision, depends upon the protocols and parameters, the worldview that you have about the world. And this is what he suggested about medical professions. Some emphasis on super specialists, a few patients of an upper class, economic class get access to it, but the rest of the day-to-day life, people continue to suffer because they don't get access to those, and medical professions don't. I am pretty aware that you will try to sort of compartmentalize this aspect as something to do with public health and community medicine and so on. My insistence right from the beginning of my lecture is to challenge that assumption. It should be part of thinking about medical professions and the very idea of disease and the treatment, these two concepts. That's the difference. Now, let's not forget that you're dealing with human being, the physicality, and since the meaning of the body, you know that body, whenever you talk about body, is something that we do with the body and to the body. There's nothing called body in our practice. There is no body in practice, something called a body as is. Whenever you talk and whenever you do, you will suddenly find that body comes to you as something that you do with the body or to the body, as a part of human activity. And this human activity is what gives meaning to body, and different cultures give different sense of body, different ways of treating with body across human history. Why? Because since body is not is, but body is something that we do with it or to it, and it is historically and culturally contingent and in changes. You just happen to be in one point in human history where you are determined by a certain way of doing with the body or to the body, way of looking to the body or doing with the body, etc., etc. It's a particular historical moment within a particular cultural practice. In fact, medical science is a subcultural set. It's a part of culture, with its own code of conducts, its ideas and concepts. These are historically rooted. When you go back to medical history, you will see how history changes. If it is a truth, then truth will remain static. If it is ahistorical, cultural, then it would not change. It is precisely because it's cultural, and it is precisely it is historical, and it is precisely because it is a human affairs where human concepts invented by the human beings, their own practices, is what defines your profession and who you are, and the reality called the disease that you handle. It is this concept, a little bit of reflection on that. My idea is that, just as is applicable to me as a professional, the moment we started moving beyond and in fact understood what Arthur Peacock reminded us about comparing a scientist with a centipede, and not to lose our sense of reflexivity or thinking as a human being, to realize what Aristotle a long time back has already told us about what we are as a moral being, making choices and defining our world, and that's what we call it, our rights and so on. Then you will realize that reading and reflecting on this assumption, which you call philosophy, social and stuff, even when it comes to medical science, pushing it into ethical question as if it is outside of your profession, or pushing some as a matter of public health and so on. Fundamentally, what I'm appealing to do is that you change your own life as a professional, as an individual, and it will have a direct implication in the way you understand your profession and the practices that you do, which defines your life in turn. I would like to end with two noted doctors. If you think reading philosophy, politics, thinking about society is not a medical profession. Classic example, Sigmund Freud. He's a neurologist. He is an MD. He shaped the world the way we think. In fact, there is a saying that in 20th century humanity has changed by 3 Jews and 1 non-Jews. Sigmund Freud was one of the Jews. He changed the way we understand human behavior, human society. He writes extensively on origin of family to civilizations to our diseases and so on. He is not a philosopher. He is not a social scientist. He is a hardcore neurologist. He is an MD. He shaped the world. So much so that there in 20th century world, people say Marx, he's the other Jew. You know, and it said 3 Jews. By the way, the 3rd Jew is Einstein. Can you guess who was the non-Jew? People say there are 3 Jews and 1 non-Jew who changed it, the way we understand our life. Among the Jews is Sigmund Freud, Karl Marx, and Einstein. No? Any of these students, busy students, can you guess? No? Is nearer home. Not here. Home money. India. Mr. Mohanchand Karamchand Gandhi. And in fact, there is a lovely joke about him. It's very well known, London-based Indian. He is a giant among scholars in the West, Bhikkhu Parekh. And at the institute where I used to work before I joined JNU called CSDS, I had a colleague called D.L. Sheth, Professor Sheth, who was a member of the Mandal Commission and so on. He said, Vimal, Bhikkhu Parekh became Bhikkhu Parekh because of me. It's a funny joke. He says that. I said, why, sir? He said, when he came to India, though he is an Indian, he used to say, Mr. Gandhi, Mr. Gandhi. I asked him to pronounce it as Mr. Gandhi. The day he learns to pronounce it as Mr. Gandhi, he became very famous in the West. That's what he said. It's a joke, but it also tells you how cultures, mooring is important for us. So one example I've given you is Sigmund Freud, who is a hardcore neurologist. He's a doctor by profession. And in fact, psychoanalysis in the West till 1960s was only allowed MD holders to practice psychoanalysis, which changed later on because they have a new association. So non-medical people can also practice psychoanalysis. That's Sigmund Freud for you. Next one is Frantz Fanon. I don't know how many of you are familiar with that. He is an intellectual giant. He changed the way we understand how colonization and colonialism means for us. Colonialism, we have heard enough. Neo-colonialism. His theory, his take, continues to inspire and inform thousands and thousands of philosophers and thinking till today. He's not a political scientist, he's not a social scientist, nor a philosopher. He is also a hardcore medical doctor. He wrote famous books like Wretched of the Earth. He's the one who tells us that the colonizers' way of looking at the world is what we look. We have internalized. For example, many Indians will say, referring to Israel and Palestine as Middle East. Even though it exists in the West of us, they call it Middle East because it's the internalizing the way the West look at it. So their vision has become ours. So Fanon's theory is that the oppressor's worldview is what the oppressed internalize it. Feminists have taken cue from a similar line of thinking, saying that a woman tends to look at her own body exactly in the way a man would look at her own body. So people are searching for, is there a woman's way of looking at the world? Woman's way of looking at the definition of work? Woman's way of looking at the question of health? There's extensive work by two of my colleagues who does on this. This is what Fanon has described. The oppressor defines the world, we internalize, we look through that prism. This famous, a legend, almost like a legendary figure, Frantz Fanon, was not a philosopher, not a political scientist, not a sociologist. He was a practicing doctor. He is also an MD. So with these two examples, my appeal to all of you is that a place like Manipur, where the social structural violence is there everywhere, we can see increasing inequality in society. Recently, one of the advisors of Prime Minister Modi suggested that India is going to be trapped in middle income group. And he says India's growth story is driven by only 100 million people consumption. Out of 1.3 billion population, our economy is growing, we keep on celebrating it. And he reminds us that it is the consumption is the parameters of defining that growth, and only 100 million out of 1.3 billion is what you define our economy. He says increasingly people are being dispossessive, and you said that it will be like South Africa and Brazil. For a small shirt, people might kill you to get your shirt. He says crime rate will grow up if we do not fight back. That he said, if we don't do anything in the next 5 years, India will fall in its middle income trap. That's an economist telling you. Prime Minister Modi has called a meeting recently, I think day before yesterday, of economy to fight it back. How far is it going to be successful? The moral of the story is that we know that there are both personal physical violence and structural violence in our society. How many get suffering their sense of good life because of that structures? How many of them get access to your services? These are serious matter which you need to reflect. I think medical professionals like Freud and Fanon had done it. It's not only about physical entity that you are dealing with it. It's a much more larger issues that we face. And I believe that this kind of thought will make us better human being and a humane professional as doctors as well. Thank you very much.